The surface was still, too still. 10 months of silence, and then, a shape began to rise from the dark. A vehicle. A secret. A body. For nearly a year, Margaret Jan Shupe Smith's name haunted Lakeland, Florida, whispered at gas stations, prayed over at kitchen tables, posted on fading flyers. Then, without warning, the water gave her back. She wasn't supposed to be here. The road wasn't supposed to end in water. So how did a 59-year-old woman vanish from a suburban street and end up entombed beneath 6 feet of murky Florida pond water, just minutes from home? Police searched. Nothing. Locals gave up. Hope drowned. Until a volunteer dive team arrived, strangers with sonar and cameras, who would pull off what months of official searches could not. But what they found inside that car didn't just solve a mystery, it shattered one. What happened in those final minutes after her last phone call? Was it a tragic mistake, or something no one wanted to see? Because if Jan's story proves anything, it's this: the truth doesn't stay buried forever. It waits. And when it surfaces, it demands to be seen. So before we dive under, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Because tonight, we're not just telling a story. We're opening a file. Welcome to the Found Files. Subscribe, because the next name we say could be someone you know. Now, let's go back to the night Margaret Shupe Smith disappeared. Margaret Jan Shupe Smith, a woman whose life unfolded in the quiet, unhurried rhythm of Lakeland, Florida. To those who knew her, she was steady, kind, and loyal in a way that belonged to an older world. The kind of person who sent good morning texts, who checked in after storms, who never hung up without saying love you. She wasn't famous. She wasn't reckless. She was ordinary, and that's what makes what happened to her so haunting. Because it reminds us how fragile the ordinary really is. Jan grew up in a small, tight-knit family. She carried that same closeness into adulthood, always connected to her daughter, to her sister, Vera, who described her as sweet, but strong, a fighter when she needed to be. Friends called her dependable, the type of woman who'd run errands for neighbors or bring a casserole when someone was sick. Her life was calm, even simple. A modest home in Polk County. A few favorite restaurants. Grocery runs. The same routes were driven hundreds of times. Her world was local, but full. She had plans, routines, and laughter. And behind it all, she carried the same quiet resilience that defines so many women her age, balancing family, memories, and the hope that the best years weren't over yet. In the early months of 2021, the world was slowly reopening from the stillness of the pandemic. Lakeland streets were alive again, people returning to work, small shops filling with customers, a city shaking off its isolation. Jan was part of that return. She spent her days running errands, visiting family, trying to find a normal rhythm again. Her loved ones say she was looking forward to small things, visiting her daughter, seeing old friends, taking weekend drives through the back roads she loved. There was no sign of distress. No argument. No hint that her life was about to fracture. April 2nd, 2021 began like any other day. Warm Florida air, a quiet Friday evening. Jan left home for what should have been a short trip, routine, uneventful, the kind of outing that never earns a second thought. She drove her 2012 Kia Soul, a car she'd kept in good condition, the same one she used for errands and family visits. She was familiar with every turn between home and the shopping area just north of town. She had no reason to think this drive would be any different. No reason to believe it would be her last. But life has a way of turning ordinary moments into breaking points. A missed turn, a wrong light, a second too late, and everything that felt certain begins to slip. For Jan, that moment was just ahead. And from that evening forward, her name would no longer belong to quiet routines and gentle days. It would belong to a mystery, one that would pull her family into 10 months of heartbreak and searching, until the truth rose from the depths to meet them. This was the calm before the storm. The last ordinary day of Margaret Jan Shupe Smith's life. Night falls differently in Florida. The air grows thick, headlights blur against humidity, and familiar roads can start to feel like mazes of shadow and reflection. On April 2, 2021, Margaret Jan Shupe Smith was driving one of those roads, a short, ordinary trip home that should have taken minutes. Instead, it marked the last time anyone would ever see her alive. It began just after dusk. Jan had been out running errands, the kind she'd done countless times before, a quick stop, a few purchases, maybe a chat with a store clerk. She was calm, steady, the same woman her family knew. At around 7:30 that evening, she was seen leaving a shopping area in Lakeland, driving her moss green 2012 Kia Soul. The road ahead was familiar, she'd traveled it all her life. But somewhere between the safety of the lights and the darkness of the back roads, something changed. Reports later confirmed she was involved in a minor traffic accident earlier that night, near Sockram Loop Road North and Old Polk City Road, just a small fender bender, the kind of thing most people forget within hours. Deputies responded, paperwork was filed, and Jan seemed fine. Calm, even. She told the officers she was okay. They saw no reason to think otherwise. No one knew that this would be the last time anyone spoke to her. From that moment forward, it was as if she drove straight off the map. Her phone went silent. Her car never pinged another signal. And when she didn't show up the next day, no calls, no messages, the worry set in like a slow, creeping tide. Family members tried to rationalize it. Maybe she'd gone to stay with a friend. Maybe she'd turned off her phone. But by the next morning, when her car still hadn't appeared and no one had heard from her, hope began to fracture. They contacted police, who issued a missing persons alert. The investigation began with urgency, retracing her route, checking hospitals, towing yards, and gas stations. But there were no witnesses, no camera footage that led anywhere, no signs of a crash or struggle. Her Kia Soul had simply vanished. For her sister, Vera, and her daughter, the silence was unbearable. They knew January. They knew she wouldn't disappear. She was predictable, safe, careful. Something happened, her daughter said later. She wouldn't just drive away. Whispers started to spread, theories, speculation. Was it foul play? Did someone follow her after the accident? Did she take a wrong turn into one of the hundreds of unlit retention ponds that line the Florida backroads? The questions echoed louder as days turned to weeks. Flyers went up. Calls came in, each one leading nowhere. And yet, the family couldn't let go. They drove every route she might have taken, scanning the roadsides for any sign, a skid mark, a broken fence, a reflection under the water. Nothing. It was as though Lakeland itself had swallowed her whole. By summer, hope began to erode into torment. Months passed, the Florida heat baked the pavement, and still, no January. Her name faded from the news, replaced by newer stories. But to her family, she was never gone. She was somewhere. What no one knew was that she had been there the entire time. Hidden beneath the murky surface of a retention pond less than a mile from where she was last seen. Her car submerged, her story silenced by the stillness of the water. But that discovery was still months away. For now, the world only knew this: a woman had vanished from a familiar road, leaving behind a car that no one could find, and a family that refused to stop searching. And in the space between those two truths, the missing and the found, something darker lingered, the unbearable question of how. Because cars don't just disappear. Roads don't just swallow people whole. So what really happened that night? And why did it take 10 long months for the water to finally give her back? Days become weeks. Weeks become months. And in the slow ache of time, a missing person's name becomes both prayer and punishment. For the family of Margaret Jan Shupe Smith, that name, her name, hung in the air like unfinished music. In the beginning, there was movement. Flyers were printed, search parties organized, calls made to every hospital within 100 miles. Deputies combed roadsides, retention ponds, and rural intersections. Family and volunteers traced every turn Jan could have taken on the night she disappeared. But there was no wreckage. No broken glass. No skid marks. It was as though her 2012 Kia Soul had driven off the face of the earth. Jan's daughter, her sister Vera, and a circle of lifelong friends refused to surrender to silence. They met weekly, traded theories, printed new flyers when the old ones faded in the sun. Each phone call brought a rush of hope and the crash of disappointment. The sheriff's office followed every lead. A handful of tips pointed to surrounding counties, a sighting here, a rumor there, all evaporating into nothing. Her name sat in case files, underlined, unsolved. As the summer of 2021 turned into fall, the energy of the search began to shift. The city moved on, but for Jan's family, time stopped. They drove the same road she'd taken, night after night, headlights sweeping over guardrails and culverts, hoping for a reflection, any trace of her. They searched retention ponds, hundreds of them across Polk County, but most were deep, murky, and unmarked. Every pond looked the same. Every silence felt heavier than the last. The family grew used to the hollow rituals of hope. Checking messages that never came. Answering calls from detectives with no updates. Lying awake, replaying her last known moments, wondering if she'd missed a turn, if she was scared, if she'd tried to call for help. Her sister Vera told reporters later, "It was on our minds every day. Every single day, I'd wake up thinking, where else can I look?" For Jan's daughter, the pain ran even deeper. "She was out there somewhere," she said. "I just didn't know where. I didn't know if she was afraid, or if she knew we were still looking." Grief without answers becomes its own kind of ghost. You can't bury it. You can't reason with it. It lingers, waiting for proof that may never come. By the end of the year, 10 months had passed. 10 months of unanswered questions, 10 months of nights spent searching roads that led nowhere. The holidays came and went. An empty chair at the table. A name unspoken but never forgotten. To the world, Jan Smith had become another cold case, another missing woman in a file cabinet of lost names. But to her family, she was still out there. They didn't know it then, but their search was about to cross paths with another kind of story, a small group of strangers armed not with badges, but with sonar, ropes, and resolve. A team that traveled the country doing what few could bear to do, searching the water for the missing. Because sometimes, closure doesn't come from where you expect it. Sometimes, it surfaces when the rest of the world has stopped looking. And for Jan's family, that moment, that ripple of hope, was just ahead. It began with a message, quiet, desperate, and all too familiar. After 10 long months of searching, Jan's family reached out to a group they'd only seen online. Strangers, really. But strangers with a gift, a skill that had brought closure to dozens of families across the country. They called themselves Adventures with Purpose. By early 2022, this small volunteer dive team had already built a reputation for doing what others couldn't, finding the missing when every other lead had gone cold. Using advanced sonar and a calm, methodical approach, they searched the places most people overlooked, the quiet, murky waters that lined America's forgotten roads. For Jan's family, the hope was faint. 10 months had passed since she'd vanished. Deputies had searched countless locations, checked dozens of ponds and canals. Nothing. Still, when you've lived in the darkness of not knowing, even the faintest light feels like salvation. So they sent her story, her photo, the make and model of her Kia Soul, the map of her last known route, to the team's inbox. And within days, the group loaded their sonar gear, hooked up their trailer, and drove to Lakeland, Florida. When they arrived, they did what they always do, start from the beginning. They retraced her last known movements, re-examined the crash report, and listened to the family's intuition. The dive leader, Jared Lysek, noted something crucial. Jan's last known location sat near a cluster of retention ponds and undeveloped land. Dozens of small bodies of water within a mile radius. And many of them unguarded. Unlit. Unseen. These were not scenic lakes or public parks. They were functional, designed to collect rainwater and runoff from the roads. Shallow in some spots, deceptively deep in others. Covered by a skin of algae and reeds. If a car went in, it could disappear completely. And so, the search began. The team split the area into grids, towing side-scan sonar behind their boat. On screen, the world beneath the surface came alive, ghostly outlines, ripples of sediment, the long-forgotten remnants of things once above water. Hour after hour, they searched. Ponds turned up empty. Then, at one site off a quiet residential road, the sonar lit up with a shape too deliberate to ignore. Rectangular. Compact. Consistent with a small SUV. The team slowed the boat, circled back. The image sharpened, tires. Roofline. The unmistakable shadow of a vehicle sitting on its side, roughly 50 feet from the shoreline. The world above that pond had moved on, but beneath it, the past had been waiting. Jared turned to the camera and said what he'd said so many times before, "We've got a car." Divers entered the water slowly, the surface breaking around them. They descended into 6.5 feet of cold, murky silence. Visibility was nearly zero. But the contours told the truth, it was a Kia Soul. Moss green. The same model Jan drove. A chill ran through the team as they surfaced to confirm the plate number. It matched. After 10 months of searching, 10 months of heartache and wondering, the mystery of Margaret Jan Shupe Smith had cracked wide open. When the call went out to law enforcement, Polk County deputies responded within minutes. The recovery unit sealed the area, and a crane began to pull the vehicle from its watery grave. The world above watched, silent, as the Kia Soul broke the surface for the first time since that April night, dripping, rusted, its windows shattered by pressure and time. Inside, deputies found what no one wanted to believe but everyone already knew: human remains. It was her. For the family, the news was both relief and devastation, a cruel combination only the missing can bring. The answer they'd prayed for had arrived, but it carried the finality they feared most. The pond that had seemed so ordinary, so forgettable, had held her secret all along. The silence that haunted Lakeland finally had a voice again. And with that discovery, the story of Margaret Jan Shupe Smith began to shift, from a mystery unsolved, to a truth finally uncovered. But the question remained, how did she end up there? And could the road that led her into the dark have been prevented from taking another life? The water broke its silence on February 2, 2022. 10 months after Margaret Jan Shupe Smith vanished without a trace, her story, in her car, finally surfaced from the still, murky depths of a Florida retention pond. It was mid-morning when Polk County Sheriff's deputies and the volunteer team from Adventures with Purpose gathered at the site. What began as a hunch had become something undeniable. The green Kia Soul, barely recognizable beneath algae and silt, was slowly being winched toward daylight. The scene was eerily quiet, no shouting, no fanfare, just the groan of metal and the rippling of water as time itself seemed to rewind. When the vehicle emerged, coated in mud and rust, the world that had forgotten her suddenly remembered. The license plate matched. The color matched. And inside, still buckled in the driver's seat, was the body of a woman who had once been a sister, a mother, and a friend. DNA confirmation would come later, but the family already knew. It was Jan. The discovery tore through the silence that had haunted Lakeland for nearly a year. For her daughter and sister, grief and relief collided in the same breath. The unbearable waiting was finally over, but so was hope. Sheriff Grady Judd would later describe it as a tragic accident. According to the investigation, Jan had likely been disoriented after her earlier fender bender that night, perhaps shaken, perhaps trying to find her way home on unfamiliar roads. The area around Old Polk City Road was dark, with little signage. The pond where she was found sat just off a quiet stretch, its surface smooth and deceptive. There was no guardrail. No barrier. Just a narrow slope leading straight into the water. Investigators believe she drove forward, unaware of what lay ahead, and in the dark, her headlights reflected off the surface like pavement. A single moment of confusion, and the car slipped beneath. No one saw it happen. No one heard the splash. And within seconds, the pond had claimed its secret. When deputies pulled the car from the water that February morning, they also found pieces of the life she left behind, a purse, an old keychain, fragments of who she was before the silence began. For her family, those small details meant everything. Proof that she hadn't run away. Proof that she'd been where she was supposed to be, just a few turns too soon. Her sister Vera stood near the water's edge as they lifted the car from the pond. In interviews later, her voice cracked when she said, "Every day you think, where else can I look? And it's on your mind every day. But now that's over." That single line carried the weight of 10 months of torment, the exhaustion of hope, the quiet devastation of waiting, and the strange peace that comes only when the unknown becomes known. For the divers of Adventures with Purpose, it was another case closed, but not just another story. They'd found dozens of missing people, but each discovery carried a gravity that no repetition could dull. These weren't statistics. They were alive. And this time, the truth had been sitting just beneath the surface, in water so shallow you could almost wade through it. In the weeks that followed, the community of Lakeland came together to honor Jan's life. Flowers were placed near the pond's edge. The city installed a sign reading, "Road ends in water." A small act of prevention, too late for Jan, but maybe in time for someone else. And for her family, that mattered. Because the revelation of how she was found brought not just closure, but a painful kind of clarity. There was no villain in the shadows, no hidden conspiracy. Just a wrong turn on a dark road, and a system that had overlooked the simplest of dangers. But in that truth lies something deeper, a reminder that the line between safe at home and gone without a trace is thinner than anyone wants to believe. Margaret Jan Shupe Smith's disappearance had begun with a single drive, ordinary, routine, forgettable. And it ended with a revelation that would haunt every driver who ever missed a turn on a dark Florida night. The water had kept her secret long enough. Now, it was finally time for her story to breathe again. There's a moment, after the noise fades and the cameras are packed away, when reality finally settles in. For Margaret Jan Shupe Smith's family, that moment came not in the rush of discovery, but in the quiet days that followed. The water had given her back, but the silence she left behind was still deafening. Her sister Vera described it best: "You spend every day searching, praying, planning, and then one morning, it's over. And you don't quite know how to live without looking." The search had become their heartbeat. The endless calls, the hope, the grief, it had filled the space where Jan used to be. Now, that space was final. After the recovery, a small memorial was held near the retention pond off Old Polk City Road. Family, friends, and neighbors gathered, some who had known her for decades, others who had only heard her story on the news. The air was heavy, humid, still. A handful of flowers floated on the water where her car had been found, soft ripples carrying them toward the reeds. It wasn't the reunion anyone had prayed for. But it was a kind of return, the closing of a loop that had been open too long. The family spoke of Jan not as a mystery anymore, but as a woman full of life, a mother, a friend, someone who loved music, laughter, and helping others. Her daughter remembered her sense of humor, how she could make even bad days seem lighter. Her sister remembered the endless phone calls, the shared recipes, the everyday things that grief often forgets to mention. Adventures with Purpose stood alongside them quietly, their work done but their impact indelible. They hadn't just found a car. They'd given a family the one thing official reports and search grids could never deliver: peace. That peace didn't erase the pain. It didn't undo the what-ifs. But it offered something else, the dignity of an ending. In the months that followed, the pond was marked with a safety barrier, a small acknowledgement from the city that Jan's loss had not been in vain. The sign now reads, "Road ends in water." A warning, yes, but also a memorial. Because the truth is, stories like Jan's aren't isolated. Across Florida, across America, thousands of families still wait for that one call, that one clue, that one discovery that will end their long vigil. For every recovered vehicle, there are dozens still hidden beneath the surface. For every name that finds closure, there are others fading quietly from public memory. But for those who knew and loved Jan, the circle has finally closed. The not knowing, the most unbearable part, is over. Her daughter now keeps a small photo of her mother on the dashboard of her own car, not as a reminder of tragedy, but of endurance. "I like to think she's still riding with me," she once said, "just not lost anymore." And in a way, that's true. Because stories like hers, once they're told, once they're shared, never really sink again. They live on in the retelling, in the awareness they bring, in the ripples they leave behind. Margaret Jan Shupe Smith's story began with a routine drive and ended in a quiet pond. But what lingers now is not just sorrow, it's purpose. The kind that reminds us that even in the darkest waters, there's always something worth finding. And sometimes, the greatest discovery isn't in what's found, but in the act of never giving up the search. When the water finally stilled, and the last ripple faded from that quiet Lakeland pond, something else began: reflection. For Margaret Jan Shupe Smith's family, closure wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new kind of grief, one that comes not from not knowing, but from knowing too much. The dark road. The turn that never should have been there. The years of looking, hoping, replaying. Every time her sister Vera drives past that stretch of old Polk City Road now, she slows down. Not just because of the sign that reads "Road ends in water," but because that small patch of earth has become something sacred, a boundary between the living and the lost. And maybe that's what stories like Jan's are meant to do: slow us down. Make us look closer. Remind us that behind every missing person's photo, every cold case headline, is a human being, someone who loved, laughed, got tired, made plans for tomorrow, and simply didn't make it home. It's easy to scroll past their names, to assume that someone else will find them, that someone else will care. But that's how people disappear twice, first from the world, and then from memory. That's why the Found Files exists. Because remembrance is resistance. Because telling these stories, loudly, truthfully, emotionally, is the only way to keep the missing from vanishing completely. Margaret Jan Shupe Smith didn't end up on the front page. Her name didn't lead a nationwide manhunt. But her story, in its quiet heartbreak, reflects thousands of others, people who drove off a dark road, people who never made it home, people whose loved ones still wake up every morning wondering where they are. And somewhere tonight, another family is living that same nightmare, checking their phone, replaying their last conversation, begging for a miracle. If Jan's story moved you, don't let it stop here. Share it. Talk about her. Help keep awareness alive for the thousands still waiting to be found. Because the next name we speak might be the one that finally comes home. So as you finish this story, ask yourself, how many others are still out there, just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to look a little closer? This is the Found Files, where the forgotten are remembered, and where silence finally gives way to truth. If you've been with us till now, you're part of the search. So before you go, take a second. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Let us know your thoughts, your prayers, or even the names of those still missing in your area. And most importantly, don't just watch, be part of the mission. Hit like, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the Found Files. Because somewhere out there, another story is waiting, another truth buried beneath the surface. And when it rises, you'll want to be here to see it. This is not just a documentary. This is a promise to keep searching, to keep remembering, and to never stop bringing the lost back home.